All right, you guys, like I said, today we are going to be talking about classical conditioning. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The first thing that we need to think about when we're talking about this type of learning, as it is classical conditioning, it's a type of learning, how we learn to behave the way that we do. We first need to look at the idea of behaviorism. Behaviorism is one of those approaches that we talked about when you did the trace your hand example, right, of the perspectives of psychology, right? We've talked a lot about evolutionary psychology, but behaviorism is more focused on learning certain behaviors, and that is why we act in the way that we do. So two of kind of the iconic men that we're going to talk about in this particular unit are John Watson and B.F. Skinner. Watson is kind of our focus for today. He is kind of the guru of classical conditioning, him and Pavlov, which you'll see him in just a sec. And then Skinner was more in line with our understanding of operant conditioning. We do know that both of these scientists believe the mental life was much less important than the behavior, right? It's not so much what we think, it's what we do and why we do it, right? We're trained to behave in certain ways through rewards and punishments, as Skinner would say, or through natural reactions to certain stimulus, right, as Watson would say. With this idea, they both foresaw applications in controlling human behavior. Watson went into advertising, changing people's minds, getting them to buy things, and Skinner actually came up with ideas about utopian communities and how they could, people could be trained to behave in certain ways so that we could alleviate crime and all sorts of other stuff. So like I said, these are kind of our two big dogs, but when we're talking classical conditioning, we can't go anywhere without talking about Pavlov and his puppies. Yes, this slide took me about 20 minutes to create, but it was worth it because who doesn't like to look at cute little puppies? Side note, my husband won't let me get a dog, so if you have any ideas about how to convince him to let me get a dog, I'm all ears. Back on track. Pavlov and his puppies. This is something that I actually remember from my AP psychology class when I was in high school. You will never forget Pavlov and his puppies. We're going to talk memory with chapter 8. Mnemonics is a way in which we can remember whatever it might be, in this case, certain psychological terms and ideas. Pavlov and his puppies both start with P. Pavlov worked with dogs. And what did he do with the dogs? That is the question. So while studying salivation in dogs, the Russian psychologist, well, he wasn't even a psychologist at the time he started all of his research, but Ivan Pavlov found that salivation from eating food was eventually triggered by what should have been a neutral stimuli. So basically, he was studying how much dogs salivated when they consumed food, right? We're actually going to watch a video. It's a really special historical reenactment. You'll enjoy it. But it shows kind of the process behind this study. And he realized that it wasn't always that dogs, when the food was presented to them, when they became accustomed to the fact that, like, if I do this, I'm going to get food. Well, when they did whatever that task was, they started to salivate in anticipation of food. So even just seeing the food made them salivate, or seeing the dish that the food was in would make them salivate, right? Even seeing the person that brought them food, just hearing the person's footsteps, all of these things could trigger, potentially, salivation in dogs, with or without the actual consumption of food. So he started thinking, and he said, okay, let's see if we can't train, right? They didn't have the term classically condition yet, but he was like, can we train them to salivate because of something that shouldn't make them salivate? So what they actually ended up doing was they would ring a bell every time that the dog was served food, right? So they'd ring a bell, they'd serve the dog food, the dog would salivate because he was eating, right? As time went on, they were able to ring the bell without presenting the dog with any food. And that bell, which should be a neutral stimulus, right? If you just were walking down the street and you heard a bell ring, you wouldn't start salivating. But because they had been classically conditioned to associate that bell with the food, they heard the bell, and without the presentation of food, they began to salivate. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail here. We have a neutral stimulus. That neutral stimulus is the bell, right? So before a dog is conditioned, right, let's call this little pup, what should his name be? Buddy. Hey, Buddy. This is Buddy. Buddy hears a bell, right? This is before any conditioning happens. He hears a bell, and he doesn't do anything. He might be like, what are those crazy humans doing? Why are they ringing a bell at me, right? It's a neutral stimulus. He has no real response to the bell. We also know that there is an unconditioned stimulus and response. You are going to be doing a formative today that is going to ask you to identify the unconditioned stimulus and response and the conditioned stimulus and response. So just note, this is one example. We're going to look at a couple more here in a second, but you will need to be able to identify what the unconditioned stimulus and response is, okay? So we have our neutral stimulus, that's the first thing, that's the bell. Now we have our unconditioned stimulus and response, which basically is the stimulus which triggers a response naturally, and this is before or without any conditioning, right? The unconditioned stimulus in this particular example is the food, right? If Buddy over here, hey Buddy, you guys are gonna be sick of that. If Buddy sees the food, Buddy starts to salivate, right? That's a natural response. This is all before any conditioning takes place, right? That's just the natural response to a dog seeing food. So then, during conditioning, we see that neutral stimulus paired with the unconditioned stimulus, right? So they add them together, right? That bell, that sound, and the unconditioned stimulus leads the dog to salivate because that unconditioned stimulus is there, right? So the unconditioned response, the response of the dog, of Buddy here, is to salivate when he sees the food and hears the bell, right? Okay, this makes sense. We know though that it's not just like a one-time thing. Every time the dog gets fed, the dog will hear the bell, right? So this happens repeatedly with the food. So the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So that after conditioning, we see the dog begin to salivate upon hearing the bell, right, without needing to see the dog food, right? So we have now a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response, right? The conditioned stimulus, the thing that has been trained, right, is that bell makes the dog salivate. Okay, so our unconditioned response and our unconditioned stimulus, we have the dog food as the unconditioned stimulus, salivating is the natural response, that's the unconditioned response. We trained Buddy here with classical conditioning to hear the bell and associate it with food. Therefore, that bell is now the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response of Buddy when he hears the bell is to salivate, right? So following the changes here, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same. Most of the time, that is going to be the case. There may be difference in wording, but your unconditioned response is always going to be the same as your conditioned response, right? That's the salivation in this case. The difference is whether conditioning is necessary for the response to happen, right? Did we have to train, basically, classically condition Buddy to salivate because that he heard the bell? Yes, therefore it's conditioned, right? On the bottom here, the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are the same, right? The difference is whether the stimulus itself triggers the conditioned response. So like I said, we're going to watch a quick little historical reenactment of this particular experiment to give you kind of a more visual way to remember what classical conditioning is. And then once we're done with that, we're going to look at a couple of examples and just talk through them real quick.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
Okay, so hopefully that really wonderful reenactment was helpful in helping you visualize what exactly that looked like. What I want you to do now is I need you to pause the video real quick, and I want you to go through each of these examples and find the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. What is the neutral stimulus? What is the conditioned stimulus? And what is the conditioned response? Okay, so you're going to find those things. You're going to write them down in your notes. And then we're going to go over the answers. Again, you are going to do a formative that's asking you to do this, and you better believe that your FRQ is probably going to, in some facet, ask you to figure out and associate these terms and these ideas with a specific scenario. So the only way, and it stinks that we have to do this online because this, like, all this is practice, 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 and talking it through and giving feedback. So obviously this isn't perfect, but I do want you to at least go through and get some of these examples so I can talk you through them once you've tried to do them first. So pause it, you try and do them first, and then I will go over the responses. Okay, so hopefully you took a second, you went through and you did each of these examples. For the first one, your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon, the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. The unconditioned stimulus, right, is your romantic partner's smell, right? The fact that your romantic partner smells a certain way. The unconditioned response makes you feel happy. Now, your unconditioned stimulus might also be like your romantic partner, and yours relationship, right? There's a little bit of leeway there, but regardless, the unconditioned response is that you are feeling happy, right? The neutral stimulus then is the smell of the shampoo, right? Making the conditioned stimulus also the smell of the shampoo, right? Just the smell of the shampoo alone, with or without your partner there, then starts to make you feel happy. So the conditioned response is you feel happy, right? So number one, unconditioned response, your romantic partner smell. Unconditioned stimulus, then the unconditioned response, you feel happy. Neutral stimulus, the shampoo. Conditioned stimulus is the shampoo smell. Conditioned response, you feel happy. The second one here, the green one, the door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it. Soon your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks, right? The unconditioned response, getting to go outside, makes your dog's tail wag naturally. That's a natural reaction, right? Get to go outside is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is the tail wagging, right? The neutral response is the door squeaking, right? Because we know that the door squeaking doesn't, without understanding, without that training, isn't making your dog's tail wag naturally, right? You could, maybe your bathroom door is also squeaky, but that doesn't make your dog's tail wag. So we know that the neutral stimulus is the squeak, right? The conditioned stimulus is the sound of the squeaky door, the squeak, and the conditioned response is the fact that your dog's tail wags even when it hears the squeaky door, with or without getting to go outside. Okay, so unconditioned stimulus, getting to go outside. Unconditioned response, tail wagging. Neutral stimulus, squeaky door. Conditioned stimulus, squeaky door. Conditioned response, tail wags. All right, the orange one. The orange one, the nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," just before stabbing you with a needle. The next time you hear, "This won't hurt," you cringe in fear. The unconditioned response is being stabbed with a needle. The unconditioned response is fear from the pain, right? Pain is not a response, right? Pain is a sensation, right? We learned that in Sensations and Perceptions last unit. Pain is not a response. Fear is the response. So your unconditioned stimulus, getting stabbed with a needle, unconditioned response is to be fearful, right? That's a natural reaction. The neutral stimulus is the phrase, "This won't hurt a bit," right? With, like, just hearing that phrase doesn't make you afraid before you've been stabbed by a needle. So the neutral stimulus is, "This won't hurt," right? The conditioned stimulus is the phrase, "This won't hurt," and the conditioned response is fear. You now feel fear when you hear that word because you're making an association between that phrase and the fear you felt when you got stabbed by a needle. Okay, the last one here then, this teal one. You have a meal at a fast food restaurant that causes food poisoning. The next time you see a sign for that restaurant, you feel nauseated. So the unconditioned stimulus is bad food. The unconditioned response is feeling sick. The neutral stimulus is the restaurant sign. The conditioned stimulus is the restaurant sign or seeing the restaurant sign. And the unconditioned response is you're feeling sick, right? You've been trained, classically conditioned to associate the sign with the bad food, which made you feel sick. And so now you see the sign and you feel sick, okay? It's difficult to just talk them through. So hopefully you'll practice them. And if you have questions, write them down and ask me. Shoot me an email, ask to set up a Zoom meeting, hop on before the FRQ next Wednesday, whatever you need, we can talk them through. So those are your examples. We are going to then kind of shift our attention to some higher order conditioning and then the processes that exist within classical conditioning. So that's kind of the basic, what is classical conditioning? With that said, higher order conditioning is that the fact that a conditioned response can be transferred from the unconditioned stimulus to a conditioned stimulus and then from there to another conditioned stimulus. So this is just taking it the next step, turning a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus by associating it with another conditioned stimulus. Basically, we're saying, like, if the dog becomes conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, can the dog then be conditioned to salivate when a light flashes by associating it with a bell instead of the food, right? So the dog salivates when it hears the bell because he associates the food, but what if we start flashing a light and ringing the bell at the same time, right? Can we then, and the dog salivates because of the bell, and then if just flashing the light, can we make the dog salivate just from that? There's a story about a man who was conditioned to associate joy with coffee, and he could then learn to associate joy with the restaurant if he was served coffee there every time he walked into the restaurant, right? So he's classically conditioned, coffee makes him feel joy, and therefore now he's at a restaurant that always serves him coffee, therefore now he is higher order conditioned to associate that restaurant with joy. Does that make sense? It's obviously like super circular and kind of like meta, but that's okay. Higher order conditioning isn't like all that common, but it is something that has been studied throughout psychology over time. So acquisition is the first term that we're going to look at, the first like process of classical conditioning. You don't see me, but I'm putting process in air quotes. You'll see kind of how those terms fit. Acquisition refers to the initial stage of learning or conditioning, right? What is getting acquired? Well, it's the association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, right? When does that neutral stimulus, that bell sound, change to be a conditioned stimulus in which the dog salivates just from hearing the bell, right? That's when conditioning has been acquired, right? How can we tell, right? Again, like I just said, the unconditioned response now gets triggered by a conditioned stimulus, right? The dog is drooling because he hears the bell, not because he sees food. For the association to be acquired, the neutral stimulus needs to be repeatedly appeared before the unconditioned stimulus. About half a second before in most cases, the bell must come right before the food, right? It has to precede it, it has to like trigger, right? Oh, I hear that bell, I know I have food coming, right? So if we're looking at the graph here, it's important to recognize like what strength means, because you have like weak down here at the bottom and you have strong at the top. What does it mean to have a strong acquisition? Well, basically this is saying the strength of the association between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus as measured by the likelihood and intensity of the unconditioned response. So like how often and how regularly is that unconditioned response happening because of the conditioned stimulus, right? There's also a phenomenon called extinction. Again, this is another process of classical conditioning. Extinction refers to the diminishing of a conditioned response. If the unconditioned stimulus stops appearing with the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response decreases. So basically this is saying if we stop ringing the bell when we give the dog food, that bell is no longer going to initiate salivation in the dogs, right? That makes sense, right? If they don't get that reward, if they don't get the food after they hear the bell, a lot of times, all of a sudden the bell is not going to mean the same thing. They're not going to have that same association, and therefore they are not going to drool. The next piece of the puzzle here is spontaneous recovery, and this refers to the return of the conditioned response despite a lack of further conditioning. So you see here, right, extinction happens, they live their life goes on, and then all of a sudden they hear the bell and they start to salivate again, right? Without any conditioning, without any specific trigger, just out of nowhere, they start to feel that association again, right? After, so when we're talking about spontaneous recovery, one implication is that behavior therapists think that a phobic reaction has been extinguished by repeatedly presenting the phobia without anything bad happening. However, after a rest from treatment, the phobic reaction can return. So if somebody's like deathly afraid of clowns, right, they might undergo exposure therapy in which they are repeatedly exposed to clowns in a safe environment with other people around so that they lessen their fearful response to those clowns until maybe they don't have a response or a negative reaction at all. Well, if they stop that exposure, right, and they don't see a clown for a year and all of a sudden a clown shows up, right, they might get phobic again and be very, very afraid of that clown because they haven't continuously undergone that treatment. That would be kind of another example of what spontaneous recovery actually looks like. The last two pieces of the puzzle here are generalization and discrimination. I'm actually going to pause this and take a picture because obviously you can't see the definition of the two here, so just one sec. Okay, I don't know if that just automatically saves overall or if I just added it or whatever, but you can see it now. Generalization refers to the tendency to have conditioned responses triggered by related stimuli, and discrimination refers to the learned ability to only respond to a specific stimuli, preventing this idea of generalization. So looking at these two ideas, right, one, more stuff makes you drool. It's not just the bell that makes the dog salivate before they're fed. Maybe there's like a tone or like a doorbell or like a bunch of other sounds that they associate like, oh, that sounds like the bell, I must be getting fed, right? Whereas discrimination would say like, that's not the bell, that's the doorbell, that's a tone, that's different, right? So I'm not getting food, so I'm not going to salivate, right? So when we're looking at generalization, Pavlov conditioned the dog to, that was tough. Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool when rubbed. They then also drooled when they were scratched, right? That would be an example of generalization, rubbed versus scratched, okay? On the flip side, discrimination, Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool at bells of a certain pitch. Slightly different pitches did not trigger drooling of these dogs, right? So they're able to distinguish or discriminate between the different sounds they're hearing. One thing I want to note too, evolutionary psychologists would argue that these ideas have relevance to our understanding of our evolutionary kind of makeup. If we're looking at generalizations, right, if a leopard roars and then bites you, it might help you survive if you avoid other large cats who roar and maybe the ones who growl too, right? So we know that not just leopards are going to eat us, right? Lions, tigers, bears, oh my, right? They're all going to potentially eat us, so it protects us, right? We also know, in terms of generalization, abused children have been found to generally fear any angry face, right? Children who have been abused in their time look at any angry face and get fearful, even if that's like a teacher or somebody who is caring to them and is not going to beat them or abuse them. They're still afraid of that angry face because it's associated, generalized, with an angry parent who maybe has beat them in the past. Then to switch over and look at discrimination as it pertains to like our understanding of evolutionary psychology, hearing your mother's voice comes right before you get fed. It might help you to survive if you recognize and distinguish between your mother's voice among a group of people, right? My mom's going to feed me and take care of me, so I will survive, so I'm going to listen specifically to her voice as opposed to being able to generalize anybody might feed me, right? Instead, I can discriminate and say, that's my mom, she'll feed me and take care of me and I will survive. So generalization and discrimination. We're going to shift and look at Pavlov's legacy. So really here we see his insights about conditioning in general is that it occurs in all creatures, right? He studied it in dogs, but you can do it with people. We're actually going to look at the little Albert experiment, which is extremely unethical. Like you can't like train somebody to be afraid because you have to like do something to make them afraid. So we'll look at that in just a second. But all creatures can be classically conditioned, and it's related to biological drives and responses. as it pertains to science, right? Learning can be studied objectively and quantifying or by quantifying actions and isolating elements of behavior, right? That's going back to that behaviorism, right? We're not just like beings of our thoughts and we can like decide to do things on a whim, right? Our behaviors happen for a reason, right? We behave in certain ways because we have been conditioned to respond in certain ways, right? And then the last piece, or the last little step here, is insights from specific applications, right? This substance abuse involves conditioned triggers, and these triggers can be avoided or associated with new responses, right? So if you shoot up with heroin and you get high and it feels good, right? You may, in fact, see like a needle and start to feel that high and feel the need for that drug. On the flip side, they've done types of therapies to stop from drug use or alcoholism by like not poisoning, but like putting like a drug in somebody's drink that makes them feel sick so that they associate that sickness with the drink and therefore don't want to drink anymore, right? So here, this is Pavlov. Like I said, we're going to shift and we're going to look at the little Albert experiment here in just a second. And that's really Watson's thing. But do recognize Pavlov and his puppies. Don't forget Pavlov and his puppies. You will have to be able to remember these specific psychologists moving forward. So Pavlov and his puppies. Here we go. Shifting then to John Watson, basically the little Albert experiment, while unethical, gives us insight into classical conditioning in humans. He basically took a 9-month-old baby and presented this baby Albert with a bunch of different stimuli, monkeys, dogs, a white rat, a mask, like all sorts of stuff, right? Things that this baby had never been exposed to before, and the baby was fine, right? These were all neutral stimuluses as it pertains to classical conditioning. The baby didn't have really a reaction. But every time then they continued to show the animals, and every time they showed the white rat, they made a really loud, scary noise. They banged on a pipe, right? And this scared baby Albert, as you can see here in this picture, right? Baby Albert is sad, right? He's scared. And so then he begins to associate that scary sound with the white rat, so that every time he's shown the white rat, even without the sound, he is afraid, right? That's that conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus, the white rat, with the unconditioned stimulus being the scary sound. Even without that scary sound, he's still very afraid of the white rat. And you'll see this is also generalized, and he's afraid of fluffy things. He's afraid of white bunnies. He's afraid of white masks, things that are white and things that are fluffy that resemble the rat because of that scary noise. So here's just a breakdown real quick. Before conditioning, he has no fear of the rat, right? The rat is a neutral stimulus. Then they show the rat and clang and loud noises. That's the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus makes little Albert cry. He is afraid, right? That's his natural response. So then, during conditioning, they show those two things at the same time, and he begins to make those associations so that after conditioning, just the sight of the rat alone makes him cry because he's afraid, right? Obviously, this is very unethical for the reason that, like, you're potentially traumatizing a young child. And so, obviously, this study was done a while ago, and you could never do it now because you're putting a child in harm. Even like adults, you couldn't do this too. You know about the ethics. We learned about that in chapter 1. So what we're going to do now to finish up this lecture is watch the footage from the actual little Albert experiment, so you can kind of see the process that this child went through to be classically conditioned to fear a white rat.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, As you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.